The morning sun was just starting to peek over the hills when David pulled his small fishing boat up to the wooden dock. It wasn't much to look at, just an old aluminum boat with a tiny motor that puttered along at a steady pace. But it was his, and he loved taking it out on the calm waters of Crystal Lake every weekend. David had been coming to this same spot for months now. He knew every corner of the lake, every good fishing spot, and even where the water got shallow near the reeds. The peaceful morning routine had become his favorite part of the week. After working long hours at his engineering job all week, these quiet moments on the water felt like pure gold. He was just finishing tying up his boat when he heard the sharp clicking of high heels on the wooden dock behind him. The sound echoed across the still water like gunshots. David didn't need to turn around to know who it was. That particular walk belonged to only one person in the entire Willowbrook community. Patricia Miller was marching down the dock with her usual equipment, a thick clipboard covered in official-looking papers, a fancy pen that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries, and that permanent frown she wore like it was part of her uniform. She was wearing her typical weekend outfit, a crisp white polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest, perfectly pressed khaki pants, and spotless white tennis shoes that had probably never seen actual tennis. "Excuse me," Patricia called, out in that sharp voice that could cut glass. "You there with the boat?" David turned around slowly, already knowing this conversation wasn't going to be pleasant. He'd seen Patricia around the community before, always hassling someone about something. Their garbage cans were 2 inches too far from the curb. Their grass was a 1/4 inch too long. Or their car was parked at the wrong angle in their own driveway. "Good morning," David said with a polite smile, trying to keep things friendly. "Beautiful day for being out on the water, isn't it?" Patricia wasn't interested in small talk about the weather. She flipped through several pages on her clipboard, with dramatic flair, like she was looking through evidence in a court case. "I'm going to need you to remove your boat from this dock immediately." David blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "This dock is for residents of Willowbrook community only," Patricia announced, holding up her clipboard like it was some kind of shield. "I'm the HOA compliance officer, and I'm telling you that you need to move along." Now David was really confused. He'd been using this dock regularly for months and no one had ever said anything to him before. In fact, several other residents had waved to him from their own boats and a few had even stopped to chat about fishing conditions. "I think there might be some misunderstanding," David said calmly. "I've been coming here for quite a while now, and I've never had any problems." Patricia's eyes narrowed. She looked David up and down like she was trying to memorize his face for a wanted poster. "Well, you're having problems now. This is a private community dock, and you don't belong here." The way she said "you don't belong here" had a particular edge to it that made David's stomach tighten. He'd heard that tone before in his life, and it never meant anything good. "Look," David said, keeping his voice steady and reasonable, "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. Maybe we could just call someone to clear this up. I'm sure there's been some kind of mistake." "The only mistake," Patricia snapped, "is you thinking you can just use our facilities whenever you want. This dock was paid for by HOA dues from actual residents. People who live here, who belong here, who have every right to expect their amenities to be used properly." By now, Patricia's voice had gotten loud enough to carry across the water. A few people working in their yards near the lake had stopped what they were doing to watch. Someone in a house across the cove had come out onto their deck with a cup of coffee, clearly listening to every word. David noticed an older man in his 70s who lived in one of the lakefront houses. The man was standing in his garden, pretending to water his flowers, but David could see he was paying close attention to the argument. The old gentleman caught David's eye and gave a small nod like he was trying to send some kind of message. "I understand you're concerned about the rules," David said to Patricia, "but I really think you should double-check before you ask me to leave. Sometimes these situations are more complicated than they first appear." Patricia let out a harsh laugh. "Complicated? There's nothing complicated about trespassing. You're on private property without permission, and I'm ordering you to leave immediately." "Ordering me?" David raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting choice of words." "Don't. Get smart with me," Patricia shot back. I have full authority to enforce HOA regulations, and I'm not going to stand here and debate with someone who clearly doesn't understand how private communities work. A small crowd was gathering now. 3 teenagers on bikes had stopped on the path that ran around the lake. A woman walking her dog had paused to watch from a safe distance. Even a couple who had been jogging together had slowed to a walk and were pretending to stretch while they listened. David pulled out his phone, and Patricia immediately got more agitated. "Oh, what are you doing now? Calling your friends to come? Cause more trouble? I'm warning you, if you don't leave voluntarily, I'm calling security." "Actually," David said calmly, scrolling through his contacts, "I'm calling someone who might be able to help clear this whole thing up." Patricia crossed her arms and tapped her foot impatiently. "Fine. Call whoever you want, but you're still going to have to move that boat. Rules are rules, and I don't care who you think you know." David found the number he was looking for and pressed call. While it was ringing, he noticed more people had gathered to watch. The old man in the garden had been joined by his wife, who was shaking her head sadly. A family with small children had come out of their house and were standing on their front porch, clearly listening to every word. "Hi, Mrs. Chen," David said when someone answered his call. "It's David. I'm down at the lake and there seems to be some confusion about boat access." "Yes, that's right, the usual spot." "Okay, thanks. Could you bring the folder with you?" "Great. See you in a few minutes." Patricia was practically vibrating with impatience. "I don't know who you just called, but it doesn't matter. I'm the HOA compliance officer, and my authority comes directly from the board of directors. Some random person you know isn't going to change the rules." "We'll see," David said simply. "Don't you will see me," Patricia snapped. "I've been protecting this community's property values for 3 years. I know every rule, every regulation, and every property line. You think you can just charm your way out of trespassing charges with a phone call?" The woman walking her dog had moved closer, and David could hear her whispering to someone on her phone. "You should see this," she was saying. "Patricia's having a complete meltdown at the dock. No, some guy with a fishing boat. She's being absolutely horrible to him." David noticed that several people were now recording the confrontation with their phones. In today's world, everything ended up online, and Patricia seemed completely oblivious to the fact that her behavior was being documented for the world to see. "Look," David tried one more time. "Why don't we just wait a few minutes for Mrs. Chen to get here? She can explain the situation better than I can." "I don't care about your Mrs. Chen," Patricia declared loudly. "I care about unauthorized people using facilities that hardworking residents pay for through their HOA dues. Do you have any idea how much it costs to maintain a dock like this? The insurance alone is thousands of dollars a year." The teenagers on bikes were now openly laughing at Patricia's dramatics. One of them had his phone out and was clearly live streaming the whole thing. "Y'all are not going to believe this HOA lady," he was saying to his phone. "She's completely losing it over a fishing boat." David remained calm, but inside he was getting tired of Patricia's attitude. He'd been nothing but polite. He'd offered reasonable solutions, and she just kept escalating the situation. He was starting to understand why so many people in the community complained about her behind closed doors. "You know what?" Patricia announced, pulling out her own phone. "I'm done playing games. I'm calling the police right now to report trespassing." "That's your choice," David said quietly. "But you might want to wait just a few more minutes before you do that." "Why? So your friend can come make up some story? So you can waste more of my time with lies and excuses?" Just then, a golf cart came puttering down the path toward the dock. Behind the wheel was a small elderly Asian woman with silver hair and a kind face. She was carrying a manila folder and looked slightly out of breath, like she'd hurried to get there. "Oh, good," David said with visible relief. "Here's Mrs. Chen now." Patricia looked at the approaching golf cart with suspicion. "I don't care if you called the president," she declared. "Rules are rules, and I'm not backing down." David just smiled and waited for Mrs. Chen to reach the dock. Something told him that Patricia Miller was about to have a very educational morning. Mrs. Chen parked her golf cart near the dock and slowly climbed out, clutching her manila folder carefully. She was probably in her 70s, with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of calm presence that made people automatically feel better about whatever problem they were facing. "Good morning, David," she said with a warm smile. I'm sorry you had to call me about this. Patricia immediately stepped forward, practically blocking Mrs. Chen's path to the dock. Excuse me, ma'am, but this is official HOA business. Unless you're a board member, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Mrs. Chen looked at Patricia with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with difficult people many times before. Actually, I'm Linda Chen. I'm the property manager for Crystal Lake Holdings. Property manager for what? Patricia demanded, still holding her clipboard like a weapon. For the lake, Mrs. Chen replied simply, and the surrounding property. Patricia's confident expression flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. Well, that's nice, but I'm the HOA compliance officer for Willowbrook Community, and this man is trespassing on our dock. By now, the crowd of onlookers had grown even larger. The joggers had given up any pretense of exercising and were standing openly watching the drama unfold. The woman with the dog had been joined by two neighbors, and they were whispering among themselves. The teenagers were still filming everything, providing running commentary for their social media followers. Mrs. Chen opened her folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. I think there might be some confusion here. Could you tell me exactly what the problem is? Patricia puffed up like an angry bird. The problem is that this man has no right to dock his boat here. This is private community property, paid for and maintained by HOA dues from actual residents. I see, Mrs. Chen said thoughtfully. She flipped through several pages in her folder. And you're saying the HOA owns this dock? Of course we do, Patricia declared. The Willowbrook community has exclusive rights to this entire lakefront area. David had to bite his lip to keep from smiling. He could see where this was going, and it was going to be interesting. Mrs. Chen pulled out a document that looked official and important. Well, that's partially correct. The Willowbrook community does have rights to use this dock in the surrounding lake area, but they don't own it. Patricia's face went red. What are you talking about? Of course we own it. We paid for it. We maintain it, and we make the rules about who can use it. Actually, Mrs. Chen said in her gentle but firm voice, you pay for the right to use it. There's a difference. The old man who had been watching from his garden had now walked over to join the crowd. David noticed he was trying to hide a smile behind his coffee cup. This is ridiculous, Patricia snapped. I don't know who you people think you are, but I'm calling the police right now to settle this once and for all. Before you do that, Mrs. Chen said calmly, maybe you should look at this. She handed Patricia a document from her folder. Patricia snatched the paper and started reading, her eyes moving quickly across the page. At first, she looked confident, like she was expecting to find something that would prove her point. But as she read further, her expression began to change. This can't be right, she muttered. What does it say? Asked one of the neighbors, who had gathered to watch. Patricia was still staring at the document, her face getting paler by the second. It says the lake is privately owned by Crystal Lake Holdings, and that Willowbrook community pays monthly fees for access rights. That's correct, Mrs. Chen confirmed. Your HOA has been paying those fees for over 10 years now, every month like clockwork. The crowd was getting bigger and more interested. Someone else had started recording with their phone, and David could hear people calling their friends to come watch the drama. But that's impossible, Patricia insisted. We would know if we were paying rent to use our own lake. Mrs. Chen smiled sadly. You might be surprised how many people don't read their HOA documents carefully. The fees are listed right there in your monthly statements under lake access and maintenance. David watched as Patricia's confident mask began to crack. She was flipping through the document frantically, looking for something that would prove her right. Even if this is true, Patricia said, her voice getting higher and more desperate, it doesn't give just anyone the right to use our dock. There are still rules about who can be here. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Chen agreed. There are definitely rules about dock usage. Patricia looked relieved for a moment until Mrs. Chen continued. The rules state that dock access is available to Crystal Lake Holdings property owners, their family members, and their authorized guests. Exactly, Patricia exclaimed. And this man is clearly none of those things. Mrs. Chen looked at David with twinkling eyes. David, would you like to explain, or should I? By now, even more people had gathered. The entire drama was being broadcast live on social media, and David could see people sharing the videos in real time. The hashtag HOA was already starting to trend in their local area. I think you should explain, Mrs. Chen, David said quietly. You're much better at this than I am. Patricia was looking back and forth between them, clearly sensing that something was very wrong with her understanding of the situation, but not quite able to figure out what it was. Mrs. Chen pulled out another document from her folder. Patricia, is it? You seem very concerned about following the rules, which I respect. So let me make sure you understand exactly what the rules are. She held up the paper so Patricia could see it clearly. This is the current property deed for Crystal Lake and the surrounding 200 acres. It shows that the land has been owned by the same family for 3 generations. Patricia grabbed the document and started reading it frantically. The crowd pressed closer, everyone trying to see what was written on the paper that was making Patricia's face turn so many different shades of red and white. According to this deed, Mrs. Chen continued, the current owner inherited the property from his grandfather, who originally owned over 500 acres in this area. In the 1980s, the grandfather sold off parcels of land to developers while keeping ownership of the lake itself. That's... Patricia's voice came out as barely a whisper. That's not possible. The developer who built Willowbrook Community negotiated a long-term lease agreement for lake access, Mrs. Chen explained patiently. Your HOA has been honoring that agreement ever since. Every month you pay rent to use what you thought was your own lake. The teenagers who had been filming everything were now providing live commentary like sports announcers. Y'all, this is better than any reality TV show, one of them was saying into his phone. This HOA lady just found out she doesn't own the lake she's been guarding like a dragon. Patricia was still staring at the deed, her hands shaking slightly. But who owns it then? Mrs. Chen smiled and gestured toward David. Meet David Thompson, the current owner of Crystal Lake and all surrounding water rights. The silence that followed was so complete that David could hear birds singing across the lake. Even the teenagers stopped talking into their phones for a moment. Patricia's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish that had been pulled out of water. You mean, someone in the crowd finally said. This whole time she was yelling at the guy who actually owns the lake? That's exactly what I mean, Mrs. Chen confirmed. The old man from the garden stepped forward, no longer trying to hide his grin. I was wondering when this was going to happen. I've been living here for 15 years, and I remember when David's grandfather used to come fishing at this same dock. The family resemblance is pretty strong. Patricia finally found her voice again, though it came out as more of a squeak than her usual commanding tone. This has to be some kind of mistake. David decided it was time to speak up. Patricia, I tried to tell you that the situation was more complicated than it looked. You were so determined to kick me out that you wouldn't listen. But you were just sitting there with your little boat, Patricia protested weakly. You didn't say anything about owning the lake. You didn't give me much chance to explain, David replied. Every time I tried to tell you there might be a misunderstanding, you got louder and more aggressive. The crowd was loving every minute of this reversal. People were calling their friends and family members to come witness Patricia's humiliation. The story was spreading through the community faster than gossip at a high school reunion. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat gently. Now, Patricia, I hope you understand that David has every right to dock his boat here. In fact, he has more right to be here than anyone else in the entire community. Patricia was still clutching the property deed, staring at it like she hoped the words would magically change if she looked hard enough. This can't be happening, she whispered to herself. But it was happening, and everyone was watching. The news about David owning the lake spread through Willowbrook Community faster than a wildfire. Within an hour of the confrontation at the dock, everyone seemed to know what had happened. People were sharing videos, making phone calls, and gathering in small groups to discuss the shocking revelation. Patricia had disappeared from the dock almost immediately after Mrs. Chen showed her the property deed. She'd mumbled something about needing to check her records and practically ran back to her house, still clutching her clipboard like it could somehow protect her from the embarrassment. But Patricia wasn't the type of person to give up easily. By that afternoon, she was back in full force and she was angry. Really angry. She spent the rest of the day making phone calls to every HOA board member she could reach. Her story kept changing slightly with each call, but the basic message was the same. There had been some kind of mistake and she needed help fixing it. "This is completely unacceptable," she told board member after board member. "We need to call an emergency meeting immediately. Our property values are at stake here." Most of the board members had already heard about the morning's drama through the community gossip network. Some had even watched the videos that were now circulating on social media. But Patricia was persistent, and she knew exactly which buttons to push to get people's attention. "Think about what this means," she told Robert Chen, the HOA president. "If word gets out that we don't actually own our own lake, what's going to happen to our home values? People bought houses here specifically because of lakefront access." Robert, who was Mrs. Chen's nephew and had grown up hearing stories about the lake's real ownership, tried to explain the situation calmly. "Patricia, this isn't actually a problem. The community has had lake access for over 10 years. Nothing's changed except that now we know who we're paying the fees to." But Patricia wasn't interested in calm explanations. "Everything has changed. We have some random person claiming to own our lake, and we're just supposed to accept that? What if he decides to raise the fees? What if he kicks us out entirely?" She managed to convince enough board members that there was a crisis requiring immediate attention. An emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for that evening at the community center. Word about the meeting spread just as quickly as the original story had. By 6 o'clock, the community center was packed with more people than had attended any HOA meeting in years. Everyone wanted to hear Patricia's side of the story and see what she planned to do about the situation. Patricia had spent the afternoon preparing for this meeting like she was preparing for war. She had charts, graphs, property maps, and a PowerPoint presentation that she'd put together in record time. She'd also called her lawyer, her real estate agent, and anyone else she thought might be able to help her prove that David's claim was somehow fake. The meeting started with Patricia standing at the front of the room looking more confident than she had any right to feel given the morning's events. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, clicking to her first PowerPoint slide. "We're facing a serious threat to our community, and we need to act quickly to protect our interests." About half the room was nodding along with her, but the other half looked skeptical. Many people had already seen the videos from the dock confrontation, and they weren't impressed with how Patricia had handled herself. "This morning," Patricia continued, "an individual attempted to claim ownership of our community lake. He had some documents that looked official, but we all know how easy it is to forge paperwork these days." Someone in the back of the room raised their hand. "Patricia, I saw the video. That man seemed pretty calm and reasonable. You were the one yelling and making threats." Patricia's face flushed red. "That's exactly what he wanted you to think. These people are very good at playing the victim to get sympathy." The room got quiet at that comment. Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Robert Chen, the HOA president, cleared his throat. "Patricia, maybe we should focus on the facts rather than assumptions about people's motivations." But Patricia was on a roll now. She clicked to her next slide, which showed a map of the community. "Look at this property layout. It's obvious that the lake is part of our community. It's surrounded by our houses, maintained by our fees, and used exclusively by our residents." "Actually," said a voice from the middle of the room, "that's not entirely accurate." Everyone turned to see Mrs. Chen standing up. She had her manila folder with her again. Patricia's confident expression faltered. "Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, this is an HOA meeting for residents only. I'm here as a representative of the HOA property owner," Mrs. Chen replied calmly. "Since this meeting is apparently about his property, I thought he should have someone present to provide accurate information." "His alleged property," Patricia corrected quickly. Mrs. Chen smiled and pulled out a thick folder. Would you like to see the original deed from 1962? Or maybe the survey maps from when the community was built? I have copies of all the paperwork. Patricia looked nervous but tried to maintain her aggressive stance. Anyone can print fake documents. What we need is an independent investigation to verify these so-called claims. That's an excellent idea, Mrs. Chen agreed. In fact, I brought copies of the county records office documentation. These are official government records that anyone can verify. She started handing out photocopies to people in the front row. As the documents made their way through the crowd, Patricia's PowerPoint presentation began to seem less and less impressive. According to these records, Mrs. Chen explained, the Thompson family has owned Crystal Lake continuously since 1962. David's grandfather, William Thompson, bought the original 500-acre tract from the county. In the 1980s, he sold parcels to developers while keeping the lake and 200 surrounding acres. An older woman in the front row raised her hand. I remember William Thompson. He used to let local kids fish from his dock during the summers. Nicest man you could meet. That's right, agreed another longtime resident. He was always very generous about sharing the lake with neighbors. Even after the community was built, he never made a fuss about people using the water. Patricia was getting more frustrated by the minute. This is all very interesting, but it doesn't change the fact that we've been paying for this lake access for years. That gives us rights. You're absolutely correct, Mrs. Chen said. You do have rights. Specifically, you have the rights outlined in your lease agreement, which guarantees lake access in exchange for monthly fees. But what happens when the lease expires? Someone called out. Mrs. Chen consulted her papers. The current agreement runs through the end of this year. After that, it would need to be renewed. The room got very quiet as people realized what this meant. Their lake access wasn't guaranteed forever. It depended on maintaining a good relationship with the actual owner. Patricia saw her opening and jumped on it. Exactly. This man could kick us all out at the end of the year. Our property values would collapse overnight. Has he threatened to do that? Robert Chen asked. Well, no, Patricia admitted. But after this morning's misunderstanding, who knows what he might do? The room was buzzing with worried conversations now. People were starting to realize that Patricia's confrontational approach might have serious consequences for the entire community. Maybe, suggested one of the board members, we should invite this David person to our next meeting. Give him a chance to explain his intentions directly. Patricia looked horrified. Absolutely not. We cannot appear weak by inviting him to negotiate. We need to show strength and unity. Actually, Mrs. Chen said quietly, David is already planning to attend your next regular meeting. He wanted to introduce himself properly to the community and discuss the future of the lake access agreement. When is that meeting? Someone asked. Next Tuesday, Robert answered. 7 o'clock, right here. The crowd started talking excitedly among themselves. This was turning into the most interesting HOA drama anyone could remember. Patricia was looking desperate now. Her carefully planned presentation was falling apart, and people were starting to turn against her approach. Listen to me, she said, raising her voice to get attention. We cannot let this man divide our community. We need to stand together and fight for what's rightfully ours. But her words were having the opposite effect. People were starting to realize that Patricia's aggressive attitude had potentially put their lake access at risk. Maybe, said the woman with the dog who had watched the morning's confrontation. We should be thinking about how to apologize for this morning, rather than how to fight. Several people nodded in agreement. The mood in the room was shifting away from Patricia's combative approach toward a more reasonable strategy. Patricia could see she was losing control of the narrative. Fine, she said, shutting off her PowerPoint presentation. But don't come crying to me when this man raises our fees or kicks us out entirely. I tried to protect this community, and you're all too blind to see the threat we're facing, she gathered her materials and stormed out of the meeting, leaving behind a room full of worried residents who were starting to realize that their self-appointed protector might have made their situation much worse. The week between the emergency meeting and the regular Tuesday meeting, Felt like the longest week in Willowbrook community history. Everyone was talking about what might happen when David finally showed up to address the community directly. Some residents spent the time trying to research the property records themselves, wanting to verify Mrs. Chen's claims. Others were busy calculating how much their home values might drop if they lost lake access. A few forward-thinking neighbors started brainstorming ways to apologize for Patricia's behavior and make a good impression on their actual landlord. Patricia, meanwhile, had gone strangely quiet. After her dramatic exit from the emergency meeting, she'd barely been seen around the community. Her usual morning walks around the neighborhood had stopped. She wasn't patrolling the streets looking for HOA violations. Even her perfectly manicured lawn was starting to look a little neglected. But Patricia wasn't hiding. She was planning. She'd spent the entire week on the phone with lawyers, property experts, and anyone else she thought might help her find a way out of this embarrassing situation. She was convinced there had to be some legal loophole, some technicality that would prove David's ownership was invalid. By Tuesday morning, Patricia was ready for round 2. The community center was even more packed than it had been for the emergency meeting. Word had spread beyond Willowbrook, and some people from neighboring communities had shown up just to watch the drama unfold. The local coffee shop was doing record business as people grabbed drinks before the meeting. David arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a simple button-down shirt and khakis. He looked calm and relaxed, like he was heading to a friendly neighborhood barbecue rather than a potentially hostile confrontation. Mrs. Chen was with him, carrying her ever-present folder of documents. They took seats in the back of the room, and David spent the time before the meeting started chatting quietly with the people sitting nearby. He asked about their families, complimented someone's garden, and generally acted like the friendly neighbor he'd always been. Patricia, on the other hand, arrived exactly on time, wearing her most professional outfit and carrying a briefcase that looked like it could hold enough legal documents to sink a battleship. She marched to the front of the room and sat up at a table facing the audience like she was preparing for a trial. Robert Chen called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. Before we get to regular business, I think we should hear from David Thompson about the lake access situation that's been concerning everyone. David stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room. The entire crowd fell silent, waiting to hear what he had to say. "Thank you for having me," he began with a genuine smile. "I know this past week has been confusing and stressful for a lot of you, and I'm sorry about that." He paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with people in different sections. "First, I want to be completely clear about something. I have no intention of ending your lake access, none whatsoever." A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. Several people actually applauded. "The lake has been shared with this community for over a decade," David continued. "My grandfather started that tradition, my father continued it, and I plan to honor it as well." Patricia couldn't contain herself any longer. She jumped up from her table and interrupted. "That's all very nice to say, but what guarantees do we have? What's to stop you from changing your mind next month?" David turned to look at her calmly. "Well, Patricia, I'm glad you asked. Mrs. Chen, could you share what we've prepared?" Chen stood up and pulled out a document that looked official and important. "David has had his lawyers draft a new long-term lease agreement. Instead of the year-to-year arrangement you've had, this would be a 25-year contract with automatic renewal options." The room buzzed with excited conversations. A 25-year guarantee was more security than they'd ever had before. But Patricia wasn't finished fighting. "And what's this going to cost us? I'm sure these generous terms come with a hefty price increase." David smiled and shook his head. "Actually, the fees are staying exactly the same. The only change is the length of the contract and some updated maintenance responsibilities." Now people were really excited. Someone in the middle of the room actually cheered. Patricia's face was getting red again. "This doesn't make any sense. Why would you offer such favorable terms to people you don't even know?" "But I do know you," David replied. "I've been coming to this lake for months. I've met many of you, talked with you, fished alongside some of you. This is a good community full of good people." He paused and looked directly at Patricia. "Most of you, anyway." The room got very quiet at that comment. Everyone knew exactly what David was referring to. Patricia realized she was losing the crowd, so she decided to play her final card. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Before everyone gets too excited," she announced, "I think you should know that I've been doing some investigating of my own this week." She held up the papers dramatically. "These documents raise some serious questions about the validity of Mr. Thompson's claims." David raised an eyebrow but didn't look worried. "What kind of questions?" Patricia began reading from her papers. "According to my research, there are several discrepancies in the property records. Survey boundaries that don't match, deed descriptions that seem incomplete, and filing dates that appear suspicious." Mrs. Chen looked at David and almost smiled. "Would you like me to address this, or should we let her continue?" "Let's hear what else she found," David said patiently. Patricia gained confidence from his calm response. "I've also discovered that the original land purchase in 1962 may not have included water rights. In some states, water rights are separate from land ownership." A few people in the crowd looked worried again. Maybe Patricia had found something after all. "Furthermore," Patricia continued, getting more animated, "I have evidence that suggests the Thompson family may have been delinquent on property taxes at various times over the years, which could have affected their ownership status." She looked around the room triumphantly, expecting to see people rallying to her side. Instead, she saw a lot of confused and uncomfortable faces. David let her finish completely before responding. "Patricia, those are some serious accusations. I hope you have solid evidence to back them up." "I absolutely do," she declared, waving her papers in the air. "Good," David said, "because making false claims about someone's property ownership can have legal consequences." Mrs. Chen stood up and addressed Patricia directly. "I'm curious about your sources for this information. Could you tell us where you got these documents?" Patricia hesitated for the first time. I obtained them through proper legal channels." "Which channels specifically?" Mrs. Chen pressed. That's not important. What matters is the information they contain." David stepped forward. "Actually, Patricia, it is important, because if you've been making false statements about my family's property ownership, that could be considered defamation." The room was dead silent now. This had taken a serious turn that no one had expected. Mrs. Chen pulled out her own folder and addressed the crowd. "For anyone who's concerned about Patricia's claims, I have certified copies of all property records directly from the county clerk's office. Water rights, tax records, survey maps. Everything is properly documented and up to date." She began handing out copies to anyone who wanted them. "These are the same documents that any title company or real estate lawyer would use to verify ownership. They're all public records that anyone can check." Patricia was starting to look desperate. Her big reveal wasn't having the effect she'd hoped for. "Even if the ownership is legitimate," she said, her voice getting higher, "we still have the problem of this man's attitude. Do you really want to depend on someone who's already shown hostility toward community members?" David looked genuinely confused. "Hostility? Patricia, you're the one who was yelling and making threats at the dock. I never raised my voice or said anything hostile to you. You were recording me without permission." "Actually," called out one of the teenagers who had filmed the original confrontation, "I was recording you, and you were totally out of line." Several people laughed, which made Patricia even more flustered. David raised his hand to quiet the room. "Look, I understand that this situation has been stressful for everyone. Change is never easy, even when it's change for the better." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "I grew up fishing on this lake with my grandfather. Some of my best childhood memories happened right here. I want your children and grandchildren to have the same kinds of memories." Patricia made one last desperate attempt. "What about the fishing club? They've had exclusive access to the best fishing spots for years. Are you going to honor their special arrangements?" David was quiet for a long moment, and the room held its breath waiting for his answer. "Actually, Patricia, I'm glad you brought that up. The fishing club's lease expires at the end of this month." Patricia looked hopeful for the first time, all evening. "And after everything that's happened this week, I've decided not to renew it." The hope drained from Patricia's face as David continued. Instead, fishing access will be available to all community residents on an equal basis. No more exclusive arrangements or special privileges. The crowd erupted in applause. This was actually better than what they'd had before. Patricia gathered her papers and stuffed them back into her briefcase. "This isn't over," she muttered, but everyone could see that it absolutely was over. As people began to leave the meeting, many stopped to shake David's hand and welcome him properly to the community. The atmosphere was celebratory, like a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Patricia slipped out through a side door, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The next morning, a for sale sign appeared in her front yard.